Before we begin, I'd like to ask you for a small favor. I'm working really hard to reach my goal of 1,000 subscribers. It's a truly important milestone for me. Please click the subscribe button on the channel. It's just one click, but it gives me massive motivation to keep making more videos. Thank you all so much. Inside the Gran Montoya Hotel, crystal chandeliers cast the first winter light upon the ballroom, with the melancholic generosity of something remembering better times. Waiters in black and white moved between round tables draped in cream linen. A pianist near the south wall played something slow and imperceptible, the kind of music that exists to fill silence without disturbing it. That night, a charity gala was being held to raise funds for families who had lost their homes in recent fires. Some 400 guests, tuxedos, and long dresses. Most had come on the advice of their tax advisors. A few had come because they genuinely cared, and almost none knew that in the side room adjacent to the main one, a man named Cristóbal Bravo had been waiting for nearly an hour for the opportune moment to humiliate someone he barely knew. Cristóbal stood by the bar with a brandy snifter in hand, adjusting his tie, which had cost more than he'd earned in his first year after trade school. Around him, 4 colleagues from his building maintenance firm, all in suits a size too small, all already too loud for the hour. He'd told them earlier that the prank would be perfect, that in the end, they'd all have succeeded in irritating exactly the man they'd endured in silence for years. That man was, of course, Carlos Reyes, and the woman they'd chosen to humiliate alongside him was a quiet figure already seated at the central table in the side room, a woman with brown hair and a champagne-colored dress. When the door to the side room opened a few minutes later, Carlos Reyes entered, holding the small hand of his 6-year-old daughter, Lucia. He wore a navy suit he'd owned for nearly a decade, a white shirt he'd ironed on the kitchen counter that afternoon, and leather shoes so polished, so often, that their tips had lost their original shine and replaced it with something more honest. It showed in everything that he didn't quite belong in this kind of room, and yet he walked with the quiet dignity of a man who had long ago decided not to apologize for it. Lucia wore a pale blue dress and clutched a worn plush rabbit she called Pipo to her chest. And the moment they crossed the threshold, the laughter from Cristóbal's table rose like a flock of birds startled from a tree. Carlos hadn't always been a single father. He'd grown up in a quiet neighborhood west of Seville, the son of an electrician and a night shift nurse, and from a young age had loved the way broken things became whole again under careful hands. He hadn't gone to university because his family couldn't afford it, and he'd never been the kind of young man to resent it. He learned a trade, took pride in it, and married at 22 to a woman who had at first loved his stability, and who later, as the years thinned and the bills did not, had come to resent it. When Lucia was just over a year old, his wife had left a folded note on the kitchen table that said only that she couldn't do this anymore, and she'd left before dawn. Carlos had stood for a long time in the hallway that morning, with the note in one hand and the warm weight of his daughter in the other arm. And somewhere in the silence between those two things, he'd decided what kind of father he was going to be. He wouldn't be loud, he wouldn't be perfect, but he wouldn't be absent, and he wouldn't let his daughter learn from him that the world owed her bitterness. In the years that followed, he'd taught himself to braid hair from old videos, to make a chicken broth Lucia called the warm-up, to mend the cuffs of a small coat that grew too small every 3 winters running. At work, his foreman trusted him because his repairs lasted. His invoices were honest, and he'd never raised his voice on a job site. But Cristóbal Bravo and the men who orbited Cristóbal had decided from the start that Carlos's quiet decency was an insult to their louder, lazier lives, and they'd begun calling him Mr. Lunchbox because he carried his meals in a steel lunchbox his father had given him in 1994. Once in the company break room, Lucia had overheard one of those men say something cruel about her father needing a woman the way a stray dog needed a home. That night, in the small kitchen of their apartment, Lucia had asked him if she made him hard to love. Carlos had put his fork down on the table, looked at her for a long moment, and then told her very slowly that she was the reason he tried to be a man worth loving. He'd remembered that conversation as he'd fastened the jacket of his suit on the night of the gala. At the central table in the side room, Adriana Montoya sat with her hands folded carefully in her lap, the way a woman sits who has learned to remain still under scrutiny. She was 28. Brown hair fell in loose waves past her shoulders. A champagne-colored dress caught the chandelier light along its narrow hem. She was by any measure a beautiful woman. But the kind of beauty she wore was not the kind that asked to be looked at. It was the kind that had survived being looked at the wrong way. 6 years earlier, Adriana had been the daughter of a small civilian hotelier whose business partner had stolen virtually everything he owned. Her father had died of a stroke 3 months after the loss. Her mother had fallen ill that same winter, and Adriana, then 22, had found work at the laundry of a hotel her family had supplied linens to for years. She'd folded sheets 50 hours a week and come home smelling of bleach, telling no one that her last name had once meant something in those very rooms. One rainy October night, walking home after a double shift, a delivery truck running a red light had hit her broadside, and the months that followed had taken away the way she'd grown up walking. When she returned to public life, the people who had once dined at her father's table had a name for her. They called her, in hushed tones and with hands cupped over mouths, the charity case, because they believed she existed only at parties so that others might feel generous for tolerating her. At one such party, a man in a gray suit had said, loud enough for the room to hear, that he didn't do charity work on the dance floor. He had carried that sentence with him for nearly 6 years, and though in those 6 years he had built a hotel group that now owned over 40 properties nationwide, the sentence had never quite gone away. She was at the gala that night because her company, Montoya Hospitality Group, had completed the acquisition of the Gran Montoya Hotel that very morning. She'd told her assistant she didn't want to be announced. She'd told the general manager, an older man named Jorge Guzman, she would observe the property's culture from the inside. So she had taken a seat in the side room and ordered a glass of water and watched the room the way a woman watches a storm she already knows. Cristóbal Bravo had been waiting for his cue. The moment Carlos and Lucia entered the room, Cristóbal rose from his seat, raised his glass, and called from across the carpet, in a voice calculated to reach everywhere. He said he was so glad Carlos had finally arrived, because he and the boys had found the perfect match for him. A woman so perfectly suited for a tired single father that the two of them might have been ordered from the same catalog. Some of the men at his table laughed before they'd even understood the joke, and Adriana, at the central table, didn't look up. Carlos walked the length of the room in silence, Lucia clinging to his hip. He stopped a respectful distance from the central table, nodded to the woman seated there, and wished her good evening with the quiet courtesy he might have offered any stranger. Adriana returned the gesture without looking up. Cristóbal, noticing the room wasn't quite warm enough yet, stepped forward to stoke the fire. He announced, now louder, that this pairing was a gift to the city. A single father with no time for his own life, and a woman the city itself had decided to forget. He invited the room to raise their glasses to the couple of the year, and added, with a wink, that no one else had wanted them, so it was only fair that they have each other. The laughter that followed was thinner than he'd expected. Some of the older guests at nearby tables had stopped chewing. A woman in a gray dress put down her fork and looked for the first time at the little girl standing by Carlos's leg. Lucia didn't understand all the words, but she understood their shape. She clutched Pipo tighter, pressed her shoulder against her father's thigh, and did not cry because she had learned, the way some children learn too soon, that crying in public made a certain kind of man laugh louder. One of Cristóbal's friends, a burly man with a thin mustache, looked at Lucia and added, in a voice that meant to be charming, that the woman across the table could start practicing being a stepmother right away and save herself some time. The comment landed in the room like a glass shattering on the floor. A waiter near the wall closed his eyes for a moment, as if the sound had struck him personally, and Carlos, who until that second had been weighing whether to leave the room with quiet finality, felt something in his chest shift from caution to resolution. He did not raise his voice. He did not turn toward Cristóbal's table. Instead, he crouched and whispered to Lucia to stay close to him just a moment, and then walked over to the empty chair at Adriana's table, pulled it out, and offered it with the same simple gesture a son offers his grandmother's chair. On a Sunday afternoon, He pulled out a second chair for Lucia, settled her into it, and placed Pipo carefully on her lap. Only then did he take his own seat opposite Adriana and lift his eyes to meet hers. He told her, in a voice meant only for her, that he was sorry. He told her that whatever it was that had been arranged for her to be tonight, she didn't deserve for men who hadn't earned the right to speak her name to make her the funny part of a joke. The words weren't loud enough to silence the room, but they were spoken with enough clarity that the nearest tables heard them. And one by one, nearby conversations began to slow. Adriana looked up from her glass of water for the first time since Carlos had entered the room, and what she saw on his face surprised her more than the apology itself, because she saw a man who had not yet noticed that he had done something noble. Cristóbal, noticing the air had changed, let out a short laugh and called from where he stood that Carlos needn't be so dramatic, that it had all just been some friendly banter between colleagues. Carlos turned his head then, slowly, and looked at the man he had worked alongside for nearly 3 years. He told Cristóbal, calmly, that if that was his idea of helping a friend find a partner, he now understood why Cristóbal didn't know how to respect any woman. A collective intake of breath rippled through the nearby tables. Carlos wasn't finished. He told the room, his voice low but carrying, that he'd come that night because a colleague had mentioned a kind woman who wanted to meet him. He told them he hadn't come to sit in a room where grown men insulted strangers and called it humor, and he told them, his gaze briefly finding Lucia, that he wouldn't allow his daughter to learn that laughing at someone else's pain was the same as having a sense of humor. The side salon fell silent, in a way that seemed to reach even the pianist on the other side of the wall, because the music slowed and then faded to a softer phrase. Adriana watched the profile of Carlos in that silence, and felt something in her, something that had been frozen for a long time, shift slightly, in the way the first crack travels across the surface of a lake that hasn't moved in years. He turned to Adriana as the silence settled, his tone changing completely, becoming softer, almost private, though every guest within a 6-meter radius had stopped pretending not to listen. He told her that if she wanted to leave the room, he would walk her to the door. He told her that if she wanted to stay, he would sit opposite her for the rest of the night. And he told her, lastly, whatever you chose, you wouldn't have to face the rest of this night alone. Adriana hadn't had a real choice in a long time. Her family's bankruptcy had been chosen for her by men with suits and fine pens. Her injury had been chosen for her by a driver who'd never written her a letter. Her reputation in the city had been chosen for her by people who had decided long before she'd arrived in a room what kind of woman she was allowed to be. So she sat for a moment in the silence Carlos had built for her and felt the shape of an offer she had almost forgotten how to recognize. And when she finally answered, her voice was steady in a way that surprised even her. She told him she would stay. He nodded once. He told her simply that then they would stay, and the matter, for him, seemed closed. Lucia, who had been watching all of this with the solemnity only a 6-year-old can manage, reached into the small velvet pocket of her dress and pulled out a mint candy wrapped in waxed paper. She slid it across the white tablecloth to Adriana with the careful gravity of a child, delivering something precious. She told Adriana that her father gave her one of these whenever she felt sad, and that Adriana could have hers if she needed it more tonight. The candy lay between them like a small white stone. Adriana looked at the candy, then at the girl who had offered it. Then she looked at the father whose hand rested on the back of his daughter's chair. She asked Lucia very slowly if the girl would be left without one if she gave that one to her. Lucia thought for a moment, and then told Adriana that she would still have her father, and that was enough. So the candy could be Adriana's. The sentence wasn't designed to wound. That was what made it dangerous. Adriana brought her fingertips to her mouth for a moment, to steady herself, then carefully picked up the small candy and placed it beside her water glass, as if it were a relic she'd been entrusted with. She thanked the girl, her voice not quite her own when she did. Carlos gave Lucia a small pat on the shoulder and told her she had done a good thing. The first course arrived in a soft silence, and the table found, almost by accident, the rhythm of two people who had decided to be present for each other without yet knowing why. Carlos asked Adriana if she preferred salmon to chicken, and Adriana, sounding slightly surprised by the normalcy of the question, told him she really didn't care. He asked if she usually came to events like that. She told him that in another version of her life, yes, but that it had been a long time since she'd felt comfortable in a room full of strangers. He didn't press. Adriana had spent years being studied by men who wanted something from her, and she had become expert at recognizing the angles of their questions. She recognized no angle in Carlos's. He asked what he asked because he wanted her to be comfortable, and that was so unfamiliar that she found herself answering with more honesty than she had intended. She asked if he was always this calm under pressure. He told her no, but that he had taught himself not to lose his temper in front of his daughter. He said the lesson had cost him more than he liked to admit, and had saved him more than he could ever repay. She looked at Lucia, who was at that moment carefully coloring on the back of a place card with a pen Carlos had produced from his inner jacket pocket. She told him the girl clearly trusted him. He replied that he couldn't give Lucia everything, but that he had long ago decided to give her the one thing he could promise her, which was that when he said he would be there, he would be there. He said it without any performance, and Adriana had to look down at her plate for a moment to compose herself. Then, slowly, she told him a piece of her own story, only the smallest, most honest portion. She told him that once, years ago, she had been invited to this very hotel for a party to which she didn't belong, and that the men at her table had recognized her as the daughter of a fallen family and had made an evening of it. She told him that after her accident, the names they had given her had taken root in the way names sometimes do, and that even now, in rooms much larger than this one, she sometimes still heard them. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he told her very quietly that a person who deserved respect didn't need to know her past to decide whether to treat her well. She then asked him if he wasn't afraid they would laugh at him for sitting there with her in front of all these people. He looked at Lucia, who had started to draw a small, lopsided heart in the corner of her place card, and told Adriana that he was more afraid of his daughter seeing him one day keep silent. Cristóbal had been watching the table from the other side of the salon, and what he saw there had begun to ruin his night. The laughter at his own table had thinned. Two of his colleagues studied their plates. A woman at a nearby table had rotated her chair slightly so her shoulder was to his back. The joke he had so carefully constructed no longer had any humor, and Cristóbal, who had spent his entire adult life mistaking attention for respect, couldn't bear to lose the room. He rose with his brandy glass and crossed the carpet with the loose stride of a man who believed he could still salvage the night. He stopped at the edge of Adriana's table. He looked down at the three of them with an expression he thought charming and observed that the picture they made was almost pretty. A poor single father playing knight, and a woman the city had once pitied playing lady. He said it with a smile, and the room cooled several degrees. Adriana's hands stilled on the stem of her water glass. Lucia stopped coloring. Carlos laid his fork down very carefully on the edge of his plate. Cristóbal, seeing he had their attention, leaned in and addressed Carlos directly. He asked him to be honest for once, in front of the people who actually knew him. He asked if, given any other option in the world that night, he would still be sitting at that particular table with that particular woman. It was the kind of question a small man asks when he wants a larger man to lie in public. Carlos looked first at Adriana with a softness that was not for Cristóbal at all, the way a man checks on someone he has decided to protect. Then he rose, not leaning forward, not shoving his chair back roughly, simply rising to his full height, and he answered Cristóbal in a voice that needed no volume to reach every corner of the salon. He said yes. He said he would still sit. He said he would sit at any table where someone was being insulted, because he could not in good conscience sit at a table where someone was insulting them. Cristóbal tried, with a thin smile, to say that Carlos was acting as if he were morally superior to everyone present. Carlos shook his head once and told Cristóbal, very quietly, that he wasn't trying to be better than anyone in the room. He was only trying not to become the kind of man his daughter would one day be ashamed to call her father. As he spoke, several guests at nearby tables looked for the first time at Lucia and saw what they hadn't allowed themselves to see before. They saw a small girl, with damp eyes, who was learning in real time exactly what kind of adults they had chosen to be. Adriana saw it too. She saw the child absorbing in silence the cruelty of a room full of adults, and she saw in the small crease of Lucia's mouth the same expression she remembered wearing as a girl at a different table in this same hotel 6 years ago. The recognition hit her with such clarity that she couldn't, in that moment, maintain her face the way she usually did. A single tear tracked down her cheek before she gave it permission and raised her napkin to it, almost with an apology. Lucia watched her. Then, with a seriousness that did not belong to a 6-year-old's body, she put down her colored pencil, slid off her chair, and walked the few steps to stand between her father and the man with the brandy glass. She held Pipo against her chest with both arms. Her voice, when she spoke, was small, but it traveled in the new silence of the salon like a note played on glass. She looked up at Cristóbal and called him sir, because that was the word her father used when speaking to men he didn't respect, but still chose to be polite to. She told him, without elaboration, that her father said that adults who were truly good didn't make other people cry and then call it a joke. She said it the way a child recites a rule learned in school, with the certainty of someone who has been told something true. Then she turned more carefully to Adriana. She told her very quietly that she could see Adriana was trying not to cry, and that it was okay because she had already seen it. She told her that if nobody else wanted to sit with her, her father would sit, and she would too. And she extended a small hand, palm up, the way children do when they are not yet sure if a friendship has been accepted. The salon didn't so much fall silent as remember how to do so. The clatter of forks at distant tables stopped. The pianist let a note linger and did not begin the next. A woman in a long gray dress at the table by the window raised a hand to her mouth and didn't lower it for a long time. Even the waiter who had been pouring wine on the side of the room set the bottle down very carefully, as if afraid of the sound. Adriana took the small hand that had been offered. She didn't trust her own voice, so she didn't try to use it. Carlos knelt slowly and gathered Lucia against him and told her in a low, tender voice that she didn't need to say anything else, that he had heard her. He pressed his cheek briefly against the top of her head. On the other side of the table, Adriana cried without sound, the way women cry who haven't allowed themselves to cry in front of strangers for a very long time, and the room around her, almost unwillingly, cried with her. The side salon doors then swung open, not with drama, but with the quiet authority of a hinge that had been waiting all night to turn. Jorge Guzman, the general manager of the Gran Montoya Hotel, a man of silver hair, entered the threshold with 2 assistants trailing him. He had been looking for Adriana for nearly an hour, and his face, when he saw her at the central table with the napkin pressed against her cheek, had softened with concern and then tightened with apology. He crossed to the table and inclined his head with a formality that did not belong to ordinary hotel work. He told her, calling her Miss Montoya, that he regretted the delay, that the board was waiting for her in the main salon, and that he had not known she had taken a seat in this side salon instead of the other. He asked if she needed anything before he escorted her back. A soft murmur rippled through the salon, the sound of people repeating a single word to themselves and finding it unfamiliar in the new context. Cristóbal's mouth had fallen open, and he failed for a moment to produce a sentence. He looked at Jorge, then he looked at Adriana, then he looked again, and his face went through 3 distinct colors before settling on something akin to gray. Jorge Guzman saw Cristóbal then for the first time, and his eyebrows rose at the sight of the way Cristóbal continued to stand over Adriana's chair. He spoke this time for the benefit of the entire room, and he chose his words with the clean precision of a man who had spent 40 years in luxury hospitality. He told the room that Adriana Montoya was the chief executive officer of Montoya Hospitality Group. He told them that her company had finalized the acquisition of the Gran Montoya Hotel that very morning. He told them, with the smallest possible smile, that they were all her guests that evening. The salon did not gasp. It did something quieter and more complete. It contracted. The older woman who had been whispering about Adriana's family earlier lowered her gaze into her wineglass. The stout man with the thin mustache found something fascinating in the napkin on his lap. Cristóbal took a half step backward, as if physical distance could rewrite the last hour. Adriana rose from her chair, lifted the napkin, laid it neatly on the table, and adjusted the sleeve of her dress with the calm of a woman who had survived far worse rooms than this. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She turned to Cristóbal, looked him directly in the face, and told him that she was aware that he had not known who she was. She told him that that was precisely why what he had done that evening mattered. She told him that he had given himself permission to be cruel because he had decided in advance that she was nobody. The sentence settled over the salon like snow. Cristóbal tried, with the last vestiges of his composure, to call the entire incident a misunderstanding. He used the word joke 3 times in 2 sentences, the way drowning men use a rope. Adriana listened without interruption, and when Cristóbal was finished, she replied with a single sentence that would later be quoted in trade publications nationwide. She told him that a joke was only a joke when the person to whom it was directed could also laugh. She turned then to Jorge Guzmán. She asked for the guest list from the side salon, the name of the works maintenance company currently under contract with the property, and a full report on the regulations by which staff, contractors, and guests were permitted to behave at any Montoya hospitality event. Jorge nodded, pulled a pen from his jacket, and began to write. Cristóbal's 2 remaining companions at the bar silently gathered their jackets. What Adriana did next was what would define the story afterward. She did not raise her voice. She did not order anyone humiliated in response. She did not have Cristóbal removed by the scruff of his neck, which would have satisfied nearly everyone present and would have been beneath her in all the ways that mattered. Instead, she addressed the salon as a whole and told them, very simply, that elegance did not live in the crystal chandeliers above their heads, nor in the cost of the wine on their tables. She told them that it lived in how each of them, on any given night, chose to treat people who could do nothing for them in return. The contract with Cristóbal's company was terminated the following morning for documented reasons of vendor misconduct on Montoya property. Cristóbal was escorted from the salon that night by 2 members of the event security team, without incident and without ceremony. He left at the end with the only thing that had ever truly mattered, which was taken from him. The audience that until that night had accepted to laugh at his signal. When the side salon had begun to empty, and the pianist had resumed his quiet, careful music, Adriana returned to the central table where Carlos was still standing with his daughter. Lucia, who was by then tired, lifted to her face the small, anxious face of a child checking on a friend, and asked Adriana if she was still sad. Adriana then did something that the few guests who remained would talk about for years. She knelt in her champagne-colored dress and her thin heels until she was the same height as the girl, and told Lucia that she was still a little sad, but that thanks to her, she did not feel alone. Lucia pressed the small mint candy into her hand again and told her she could keep it. Adriana closed her fingers around it, as if it were the most valuable object in the building. In the weeks that followed, Adriana began to design something her board did not quite understand at first. She called it the Second Key Program, a silent initiative funded directly by Montoya Hospitality. The program would acquire small, neglected houses near the company's hotels, rebuild them with care, and offer them as transitional housing for single parents and for hotel staff in crisis. There would be no fanfare, no press release on the day a family moved in, only a key delivered to a person who had not had a place to call their own for some time. Adriana thought of Carlos, as the program was still on paper. She had not forgotten the patience of his hands when he had withdrawn a chair from in front of a room full of strangers, nor had she forgotten that she had seen him do it before she had any reason to know who she was. She invited him to her office one afternoon and offered him a position as lead technical supervisor for the program. Carlos, cap in his lap, told her quietly that he did not believe he was qualified for such a role. Adriana leaned forward over the table and told him that she did not need a man who knew how to talk in a boardroom. She needed a man who could tell what roof was going to leak before the rain started, and someone she trusted to deliver keys to families. He accepted the position 2 days later. A few months after the gala, on a cool early spring evening, Carlos was tightening the last fixture in the kitchen of a small, two-bedroom house on the outskirts of town. The house was about to be handed over to a young mother named Diana Fuentes, who had two small children and a night job at a hospital. Lucia was sitting on the front steps, drawing a sun on a piece of cardboard. Adriana arrived shortly after 4 with a soft cream dress and her hair down, carrying a thermos of coffee and a paper bag of sandwiches. She was smiling more easily now than she had at the gala. When Diana Fuentes received the key, she pressed it to her mouth for a long moment before she could speak. Carlos stood to the side of the porch and did not step forward, because he had decided long before that day that work well done did not need to be observed to be real. Lucia ran to Adriana and tugged on her hand and asked with great seriousness if she still had the candy. Adriana opened her small leather purse and took out the mint, slightly crumpled from months of being carried. She told Lucia that she had kept it as a way to remember the night a small girl had taught a room full of adults how to behave like adults. Carlos, watching from the porch, looked at his daughter and the woman holding the candy and had to look at the sky for a long while before he could trust his own face. The story did not end that day with a wedding. It ended, instead, with 3 people standing on a porch as the sun went down. A young mother carrying her children into a house where, at last, the rental agreement bore her own name, and between the adults on that porch, a silent understanding that something had been built between them by an unexpected act of kindness. If there is a lesson to be learned from all of this, it is not that kindness is always rewarded. The lesson is that the most valuable kindness a person can offer is the one that is offered to a stranger before one knows whether that stranger has anything to give in return. Carlos Reyes did not know that night of the gala that the woman sitting across from him was the owner of the building. He only knew that she was a person who was hurting, and that his daughter was watching to see what kind of man her father was. In the end, that had been enough.